We'll be live in 10 seconds.
Okay.
We are live now. Good afternoon or early good evening if you're in Southeast Asia and the Far East, places like Kyoto or Tokyo. I am Zani. I'm the co-founder and host of the dialogue series on democratic struggles in Asia in particular, and also other parts of the world as well. Um, I am really pleased to host my scholar and activist brother, Dr. James Gomez, who is regional director, a very dynamic organizer of Asia Center. And his center has released a 25-page report on Myanmar coup regime's persecution, targeted persecution of several different populations, in particular religious and ethnic minorities, in addition to the Burmese majoritarian Buddhists that are opposed to the coup 2 years ago. And we have effectively a civil war going on, that the events in Burma have been overshadowed by what is happening in Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the issue or the issues are no less important for many of us from Asia or with roots in Asia. And so without further ado, let me invite Dr. James Gomez to tell us what is happening in Burma with regards to the weaponizing religions, erosion of freedom of religion, as well as the targeted persecution of federalist minorities.
Thank you, Zani, for the opportunity. It's always great to have a dialogue with you and FORSEA. This is not my first show or dialogue with FORSEA. We've done a few before, and I really appreciate the opportunity this time to speak about our new report, e-released just a couple of days ago, and already reaching 1,000 downloads. And very happy to officially launch it here today through a conversation with you. Asia Center is sitting here in Bangkok, so very close to what's happening in Myanmar, partly because we see many of our displaced friends up in Chiang Mai, a lot of them also hunkering down in Bangkok. So we are in touch with some of these friends who have been, summarily displaced into Thailand. Of course, at the same time, they are not the only ones here. Those aligned with the regime or the uppity ups with the big bags of cash, so to speak, are also here. Applying for visa, competing with the other dispersed Burmese for jobs, places at university, it's full scholarship, among other things. And I'm happy to discuss this a little bit further as we get along through the conversation. What Asia Center wanted to bring out for discussion and share, with our friends in Burma and those who support Burma, and generally, is to get a nuanced thinking of what's happening in Myanmar. Now, we know the civil disobedience movement is there. We know people are getting hurt every day. The military has resorted to using jets to rein in, gunfire and mortars, randomly civilian targets, including religious. We wanted to make a sense of it, and we wanted to look at it through the prism of Article 18 of the UDHR, which speaks about
I mean
freedom
the
of religion
Universal
or belief. Yeah,
Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR.
yes, yes. And and this is what we observe. We observe that the military junta has begun to frame the troubles that it has itself created in Myanmar, using terms such as national security and terrorism threats. You know, as I said, they construct these security threats through their own framing, problems that they have themselves have caused. And then they are responding to it through an articulated policy. So this is what we discovered. And the policies in question are, you know, very contested terms, Burmanization, Buddhization. Now, and what we predict based on the findings of the report is this pursuit of these policies, these dual policies, is expected to continue and worsen in the coming months, and is going to have severe impact on the ethno-religious minority communities. Now, I want to add a caveat that the harm that the military junta is doing does not only fall on these communities, but it also affects the Burman Buddhist community as well. And I'll unpack some of these dimensions for you. But I wanted to, you know, Zani, spend a couple of minutes to unpack for your audience and listeners this term, how we approach this idea of Burmanization, Buddhization, in terms of trying to understand how the military was using this essentially as a weaponized policy response. So because we are sitting in Southeast Asia and also, you know, Forces for Change, FORSEA in Southeast Asia, I wanted to, you know, perhaps draw a parallel to your listeners to what's happening in Malaysia. In
To
Malaysia,
where?
to
Malaysia.
Malaysia, yeah,
Right.
because in Malaysia we have this concept of Bumi Putra, which is kind of a more sort of racial term, and as well as Islamization. Now, when we use the term, you know, Bumi Putra, it's not anthropological. And when we use the term Islamization, it's not spiritual. Both are ideological constructs for political purposes to instill the hegemonic place of the current regime. So if I can switch from that articulation of how Malaysia uses, you know, race and religion, I now want to say that to some extent, of course, it's not apple to apple, it's apple to oranges. You know, to some extent, you know, what's happening in Burma is fairly similar. The Burmanization and Buddhization, they are all ideological constructs in order to justify the whole political position, and this time, you know, the military regime, to move its agenda forward. And the agenda right here is to frame the civil disobedience movement, and those at the forefront, especially the ethno-religious communities, through a policy response that is actually harming their rights. So this is kind of the broad take of the report. There's much to share, but perhaps, you know, I'll just pause here and pass the time back to you, Zani.
Right. You use two, you know, jargons, the particularly coming from academic communities. One is Burmanization or Burmaization. Right now, like we move in the post-colonial era, so Burmanization is less used than you know, Myanmarization, some say. And then the other one is Buddhistization, right? Like can you like clearly spell out what you mean by two concepts or frameworks, if you will, because those are the two frameworks although they are, they go hand in glove. They are two separate things, right? And not all Burmese are Buddhists, and not all Buddhists in Burma are Burmese, right? Or Myanmar. And so, can you explain to the listeners what you mean by Burmanization and Buddhistization?
Certainly, and we also unpack that in the first chapter of the report in section 1B. Essentially, it is an ideological construct, very much had its roots in the post-colonial struggle, the immediate struggle leading to the post-colonial era. It has evolved over time, and you are right, Zadi, that for a certain period was fairly dormant in that sense. But I think in the last years, and for this report, we specifically focus on the post-coup behavior, where we find there is a re-articulation of this kind of concepts that have been, to some extent, dismissed or have been left vacant or latent. So what we see here in terms of urbanization, and just a little bit of a historical construct, is trying to frame the ethno-minority religious group to relinquish their cultures or identities or dumbing it down. Now, part of it also comes from this feature of advantage. If you are a Burman, ethnically, you have first right to many, many benefits. So it is not unusual to hear stories of minority communities abandoning, legally their, cultural identity just to have that, administrative advantage, whether it's to apply for a new passport or ID card, or just to get access to government services, because ideologically you did have an advantage, or you didn't have an advantage. You were from a non-sanctioned, ethnic minority in particular. So this is one of the political dimensions, and we see that this has, intensified as a form of a rallying cry. Why so? Because the military regime is clutching on straws, so it has to, sort of come and, articulate that. Similarly, Buddhization, I think, again, comes from the events leading up to the post-colonial struggle. You had Buddhist nationalists, the monks, and all of that playing up. But what we see here this time, and it has been brewing, but I think it's a little bit more obvious, is that the appeal to ultra nationalists, extreme nationalists, Buddhist monks and groups, and the military, standing side by side, supporting those elements within Buddhist society. I want to emphasize here that to understand this development in Myanmar, we need to also see it in comparison about other changes in Southeast Asia. And I did want to go back to Malaysia, Zadi, to say that in Malaysia, we see similar things where, the Periktikan Nasional, made up of Bersatu as well as PAS, adopting, very, very extremist views, ultra-nationalist views on race, as well as on religion, because it's not a spiritual approach, it's a political, radical approach, in order to mobilize the people. For me, these are regimes on the wane. They are slowly fading. And this is really their last clutch straw, clutching at straws literally, so that they will resort to anything to try to mobilize support for them. And in such a way, they are hurting a lot of people. And the purpose of the report is really to kind of pinpoint this sort of evil development.
Right. Yeah. Before we get into the meat of your findings and maybe like a methodology as such. Um, Let me just interject one comparative note here. As you know, back in 2012, Aung San Suu Kyi first entered the parliamentary politics. That was, dictated essentially by Myanmar military. At the time, President Thein Sein, right? Within the 2008 constitution drawn up by the military, uh, to ensure that their monopoly grip on state remains intact, irrespective of what happens in the popular arena in terms of elections and whatnot. So that was 2012, and then there were by-elections held, and I think about 43 or 45 seats contested, and the National League for Democracy Party, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, they had a crushing victory, um, of crushing. They dealt a crushing blow to the military and the quasi-democratic regime under Thein Sein. And so I think like 41 or 42 out of that 45 or 43 seats in total, the NLD, swept. That was, the moment when the military did something similar that they have started doing since the coup of 2021 February, right? And so at the time there was no Mabata or race and faith association. Wirathu was not really a known entity, right? The notorious the Burmese man in the Buddhist monk's robe. The military started to whip up this anti-Muslim, or Islamophobic messages and images, right? Drawing comparison, or like using the images of Taliban blowing up Bamiyan statues, in Afghanistan. It had nothing to do with the Burmese Muslims who were very acquiescing and law-abiding citizens of Burma for centuries. And and so then, the rest is history, because that was followed by some five years later, a full-scale genocidal campaign against primarily Muslim Rohingyas in Western Myanmar. So, so you are seeing today, or since the coup, the military junta resorting to the same old trick of weaponizing the dominant religion or predominant religion of Burma, Buddhism, right? And then on the second point I want to make is, you know, the, the all religions, there is a spiritual and doctrinal aspect, and also there is a political ideological aspect. We say, we use the term like political Islam, when Islam, a doctrine for, or a faith of peace, is mobilized to justify violence, suicide bombing, and other forms of terror. The same thing with, like, Judaism, right? In what Israel is doing today, and also in the Christian rights in the United States, and the fundamentalist perspective, and an attempt to basically impose the extreme versions or interpretation of Christianity on the entire society, particularly targeting gay, lesbian, and other sexual minority communities, taking away women's right to control their body, their lives, right? You know the whole thing. And so what the regime in Burma is doing is really a textbook example of how these autocratic, dodgy regimes, weaponize religions while eroding the rights of the rights of a citizen to practice their faith freely. Can you talk about why you are your Asia Center took an interest in this issue and came up with this report, and how did it come about?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Asia Center works on three, programs or topic areas. First of all, is on freedom of expression and the intersectionality of technology. So we do a lot of work on disinformation, hate speech, fake news, and media literacy. So that's one cluster of our work. The second cluster of our work is around democracy, civic space, and elections, the whole political participation gambit. But again, the intersectionality with technology, where we argue that increasingly there's very little difference between the online and offline space. That's how we understand civic space. The third area we work on is freedom of religion and belief. It is actually kind of a spin-off from our work on freedom of expression, because with the increased use of social media, we find with freedom of expression comes hate, and a lot of the hate, is articulated through fake news about identities, political identities, especially as they intersect between race and religion. So Asia Center is actually undertaking a range of research on under this, gambit of Asia Center's Freedom of Religion, Belief, Knowledge Hub. And before coming to this report on Cambodia, we had done a report on hate speech in Southeast Asia. As one of our most downloaded reports. We have nearly 10,000 downloads of that report since we published it about a couple of years ago. And another report that we looked at was harmony laws. Because one of the things to understand in terms of how we communicate in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, culturally, most of us engage in indirect communication. We don't engage in direct communication, politically speaking. So the way they frame the formation of laws are also different. Perhaps in North America or Europe, we will have anti-hate speech laws, for example. Whereas in Southeast Asia in particular, they use a reverse modality. So instead of what should really be called anti-hate speech laws, they call it as harmony laws. I mean, it may sound nice, harmony laws, but the punitive
Sounds communist to
provision,
me, like the Chinese Communist Party uses that word.
yeah, but the punitive provisions within the law are as equal, if not far punitive than what you see in terms of anti-hate speech laws elsewhere. And they also peddle, terms like tolerance, interfaith dialogue, without actually addressing the nub issue. So this is why we felt that we could, try to also make sense of what was going on in Myanmar, and that's the reason we undertook this report. To give you just a little bit more context for your listeners as well, this was actually a call put out by the Asia Foundation, and Asia Foundation was collecting a range of researchers, both Myanmaris and non-Myanmaris, but who were interested in issues related to Myanmar or Burma. And Asia Center put in an idea, around freedom of religion and belief and this particular issue, and it was accepted. We spent the last few months researching the report. We also spoke to about 6 human rights defenders who work in this space, who are in country, and we did it online and anonymity, without revealing their identity or any way that they could be identified. So after the rigor of that research, as is the usual process in many of these reports, The report's draft was shared with the community of Myanmar researchers that were involved in this project. And then we got the validation, and then we took it back to do all the nitty-gritty and internal review. And that's how we brought out the report here.
Yeah, I noticed something that was missing in your report, which was uh, you know, the comparison between Theravada Buddhist countries such as Sri Lanka that underwent a major civil war, and some argue even a genocide of the Elam Tamil community, that attempted to seek autonomy, or some would say like outright secession from Sri Lanka. But Burma is another Theravada country, Theravada Buddhist country, like Cambodia as well, right? And but we didn't talk about either. You didn't talk about either Cambodia or Sri Lanka, but in this state, or at least the military that has been a dominant state controller, and how it uses the state institutions and legal instruments to establish basically a religious supremacy of Buddhism, in a multi-faith and multi-ethnic country. Right? And then, so in the case of the Sri Lanka, it was fairly straightforward. The two main major anthropological groups, Tamil and Sinhalese, right? And Hindu majority and Buddhist majority. Right? But the Sinhalese became the post-colonial ruling elite, and they drafted the constitution. They shaped the state institutions in ways their religion, Buddhism, became, the unchallengeable, supreme faith of the entire Sri Lankan nation state, right? So in the case of Burma, we have a lot more ethnic and religious diversity, and significantly. I think like your report look at the way in which the military elite used the legal and other institutional mechanisms to ensure that Buddhist supremacy. Can you talk about that as well?
Yes,
I find that rather
certainly. Yeah.
fascinating. Like, also the 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 way in which the Buddhist woman are portrayed as a population that needed to be protected from this, alien religion, particularly Islam.
Hmm. No, thank you very much, Zani. And yes, I take your point that the comparative discussion will enhance the context of this report. And you're right to mention that there is that kind of regional or sub-regional grouping of countries that we can look at in terms of Buddhism. And on the same note, I also want to flag, especially in Southeast Asia, we could also look at Islamization when you bring in Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and
Indonesia,
also try
yes.
to explain some of the developments in Mindanao, also southern Thailand, and not to, people tend to forget also Singapore. But I now want to maybe help your listeners navigate the behavior of the junta when it comes to how they dance around the legal measures, how they manipulate it, and also what are some of the non-legal measures and behaviors, both pre and post school, because they've been at it for a while. I think the first observation to make, and I'll start with international law, is the adherence to human rights mechanism. For the longest time, pot bellies Burmese generals will attend a lot of the UN Geneva meetings, trying to hoodwink everybody else that everything was hunky-dory back in Burma. And when they were accused of anything, they will raise their belly and throw out a hearty laugh. That's the imagery I recall when I, have attended some of the meetings in Geneva. Fast forward to now, There was some slight progress, and I want to just record that from 2011, because Myanmar went through three UPR cycles: 2011, 15, and 2020. Now, during the period of 2011 to 2015, and a little bit after, we did see a slight engagement with the international mechanism. Not ideal, but there was engagement with some of the mechanisms, and there was also some, gestures made that they would consider, ratifying the ICCPR, ISA, CAT. What we need to take note now that the military junta has disengaged Myanmar from that process. So that, to say the least. So I think that's the first thing we need to note. However, you find that in terms of the special rapporteurs, the work continues. They have always called out the FORB violations, and the current rapporteur, does active rounds, asks for submissions, does closed-door meetings. When we can, we also feed into that process. So that's in terms of international law. But I think what is important to note is the law as it stands, does guarantee freedom of religion and belief. The Constitution, Article 34, clearly says every citizen is equally entitled to freedom of religion. And of course, there are the six official religions and communities, that are recognized. Then you have the 1947 Panglong Agreement that also says there's a certain amount of autonomy that ethno-religious groups can enjoy.
And then, of course, the original Constitution of 1947.
That's right.
That came out of Panglong.
Yes, and then of course the ceasefire agreement recently of 2015. These has also elements of guarantee, to establish a secular state, so on, preserve religion, literature, culture, and traditional practices. But it's the subversion of these guarantees across a variety of legal documents that is problematic. There is a certain negation of these first principles, first of all, through the law of nationality. There's also, these are just more sort of legal principle and philosophical positions, also the status of Buddhism constitutions, because they are also there at the same time. So they are used for political reasons to mobilize by the military regime. But if you drill down, and I did mention the notion of harmony laws that this part of the world uses. So as part of that measure, you have, and a lot of this is targeted at Muslims and the Rohingya. Again, the group of laws in 2015 that requires the religious registration board to oversee any requests for religious conversion. Also, there may be no conversion of the spouse. The spouse is Buddhist, is married to a non-Buddhist. And then there can only be monogamous marriage. This is clearly directed at Islam, but it's not, unusual. Also, I want to point out at the same time, because there are caveats in many places, including Singapore and Thailand, South, where they also have, conditions, but whereas here it's outright no. And then, of course, the hiatus between pregnancies, especially for the Rohingya community, Muslim community, there needs to be a period of time. So these are very, very discriminatory, although in terms of best practices, the Constitution and some of the legal provisions actually do provide guarantees. So that's the anomaly that we see and the behavior of the junta in exploiting that.
Right.
I want to just
Can I
wrap up. Yeah, please, please. Yeah.
interrupt you just for a minute, a moment? 'Cause earlier you talked about the quasi you know democratic government of the civilianized military generals, like Thein Sein, for instance, from 2010 or 11 onward. The following Barack Obama's visit, the Rangoon became the political matter for anyone who is, someone in international politics. Everyone descended. Myanmar, Naypyidaw, the World Economic Forums held
Mm,
there, and because like the military was engaged in some sort of quid pro quo with the so-called international community without essentially having undergone or undergoing any type of like democratic value transformation, right? And so the international community, particularly the investors and political leaders from around the world who want to bring their corporate interest and military interests to have a slice of Burma, if you will, in those early, falsely termed Myanmar Spring decade, 10 years. The military was just going along with it because they're getting investment, they're being renormalized. Even Thein Sein was, awarded, some kind of recognition by the International Crisis Group, while his regime was fomenting this religious hatred and organized violence against Rohingya Muslims in 2012 onward, right? And so the international community glossed over and they held their nose and looked the other way, while both Aung San Suu Kyi NLD government from 2015 onward and the one that preceded her government, Thein Sein government, they were both engaged in this kind of Burmanized you know Buddhist supremacist national policies. It wasn't simply the military. The NLD was involved in in this kind of the legal discrimination, exclusion of religious minorities. If you look at the National League for Democracy's 5-year period in power, the parliament had not a single Muslim representation of essentially about 5 or 6 million Muslims of Myanmar, right? They're Bumiputra. They were born in Burma. But Bumiputra simply meant children of the soil. Well, they were born there. They buried their umbilical cord there, but they did not have any representation in the entire parliamentary system, both houses. And so I just want to, mention that it wasn't simply the military that was doing this. Suu Kyi was complicit or guilty, and also, so is in international community, so-called, because they knew what was going on, and they tried to, shove it under the rug because it was not convenient for their, fairy tale of Myanmar opening up and the businesses going there um, full steam ahead. And so I think that is to be noted if we are not to let the international community to repeat the same thing. If the junta comes up with some tricks and say, okay, we're holding elections or we're going to undertake certain reforms, and so just to look at whether there is any sign of democratic value transformation among the ruling elite, civilian or military.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you touch on the key word, values. There was no values transformation or even a values shift. And I echo the view that with the NLD, its policies never really demonstrated a values shift. It still operated within the value spectrum because it wanted to play all sides. But coming back to the international community, I wouldn't say they were hoodwinked. I think they were just glad that some gestures were made of so-called opening up or engaging with the international mechanism. For them, it was good enough to write the checks and get into business. That's really it. It was very convenient. And look where that got us, right? There was a mad scramble. Anecdotally, if you were anywhere near the Traders Hotel and sat at a coffee house, you had all kinds of international groups. Literally everybody was grabbing a table somewhere and doing a brown bag lunch and hustling on this project, and that's what I saw on the ground. When Myanmar was open for business, including INGO business. So, so I would agree with you. But then just to circle back the legal developments and the particular behaviors that we can observe very distinctively in the post-school environment and how that is, affecting freedom of religion and belief, it is the more blatant, shift towards the extreme. So here, of course, there have been a lot of laws that has been passed since the coup very quickly, all to outlaw this, outlaw that, all to try to centralize and tighten the grip of the junta. But for the purpose of this report and for your listeners, I want to draw two laws that were passed. The one is the ban on ethnic language in education, so that this is now mainstream English and Burmese. So, analysts also see that as a trend to centralize language or the concept of Burmanization. I just want to flag that as something that has happened. How it's implemented and whether it can be effectively implemented, especially in the periphery, remains to be seen. Then you have the gun laws that cuts both ways. Want to try to take the guns or weapons away from the hands of the resistance forces. Another one to put it in the hands of the militia, right? We know that the morale is low within the military under the junta. The numbers are dwindling. So it is scrambling to try to, recruit any way it can, also to push weapons into their hands. So what we see that is then there'll be a lot more challenge and hardship, especially among the resistance in the ethno-religious minority areas in the periphery. So I think I want to flag that one. And then secondly is the propaganda or the PR behaviors. Again, keeping in line with this ideological notion of Burmanization or Buddhization. One, in the very boring state-run media showing the junta, support for Buddhism. So this is, played every time, just to show. And again, I come back to your point about Cambodia, Zadi. Hun Sen is also doing the same. He's also opening temples, standing next to monks and all of that, right? Then there is also that rhetoric, the political rhetoric. Okay, you're not a true Buddhist if you are anti-junta, that also, attacking your spirituality, but from a political point of view. I also want to go to a more ideological space like Singapore. If you criticize the PAP, you will be anti-Singapore. That's how you are framed. So just to make that parallel, since there's a whole bunch of Myanmaris.
Well,
Also
the same goes for Modi's India as well. Like you are un-Indian or anti-India if you criticize Modi's, anti-Muslim
well, I
policy.
think that let's bring in the Americans also, right? Yeah, either with us or without us, right? Yeah. So and then finally, of course, sashaying up to the Buddhist nationalists, pledging the military's allegiance to them. So these are some of the things that we, discovered through our interlocutors, both from desk research, but also talking to the human rights defenders in Myanmar. I'll just pass the time now to Zani. I've got a couple of things left. One around the impact and also some recommendations the report puts out. But I will take the cue from you in terms of how you want to
Yeah,
guide
no,
me.
but I was just going to ask you if you would care to comment on the targeted, demographic groups. Then if I remember the key findings correctly, you have looked at the coup regime's behavior and its impact on the ethnic minorities or the non-Burmese groups that demand a federalist system of government, simply meaning like a group equality, right? A system that
Sure.
enshrines group equality as a foundation of a new and democratic federalist Burma.
Mm.
So can you talk about those
Sure.
populations, and not just that, and also the Buddhist majorities who oppose the military coup and who have joined armed resistance, as well as the civil disobedience movement, or even
Yeah.
like provided or provide a material or financial support to the anti-coup resistance.
Yes, absolutely. And once again, I think what we need to demand this time around, now that we know how things have panned out, is any government, any regime that wants to do good for Myanmar and all people around Myanmar must demonstrate a values shift. So I think if we are going to support any kind of political transition, constitution rewriting, this value shift should be centrally acknowledged and be made clear and followed through. So, it's something that escaped us the last time. So I think this must be a big ask from our side. In terms of the impact, and before I get into the impact, I also want to, caveat saying that, the impact is on everybody, right? But just for the purposes of report or putting, a spotlight on those who are really severely hit. That's why the focus for this report is on ethnic, religious minority. But I'll come back and explain how it affects also Burmese and Burmans, Buddhists as well. So there are four key areas of impact. The first one is those who generally, is a values position, those who promote federalism, who operate almost on semi-autonomy basis, which of course there's the intersectionality between, ethnicity and religion in some of the communities, in the periphery of the borders, the mountainous areas. They are targeted. So they're, target of airstrikes, military incursions, subversion, and while these communities are also disrupted, you will find once again Burmans, Buddhist temples are also collateral damage as part of the process. The second one is the very, very sort of evil, pursuit to damage and destroy and occupy religious sites. This happening on a daily basis. Not just churches are destroyed, but Buddhist monasteries that house displaced people, or in any way just doing the humanly right thing. They may not be actively involved in that, with the resistant forces, but they are also, once again, equally targeted and also become collateral damage. So first, you have those who have the philosophical view of, wanting autonomy and federalism. They are one source of attack, and then within that, also the targeted destruction. I think they're really trying to alter the physical, heritage landscape of temples, churches, and mosques. Next would be the human beings, the arbitrary arrest, detention, and killings of individuals, leaders, activists, which is very, very blatant. Um, the numbers are increasing. At the same time, once again, it's not just the freedom fighters, the resistance forces from the group, is anyone really who would cross swords with the junta on the side of right. And finally, the long-term persecution of the Muslim Rohingyas continues. The numbers severely decimated. I mean, international reports place them at 600, largely contained within, camps in the Rakhine state, severely restricted movements, denied many, normal living amenities and conditions. So that continues unabated. So these are the large impacts. But I do want to emphasize that while the focus on the report was nuanced to put a spotlight on ethno-religious minority, Buddhist faith sites like temples are equally destroyed by the junta, especially if they are perceived to be housing, pro-democracy activists who are recuperating from injury and all of that. Buddhist monks also count assault from troops when they are practicing their religious faith. If the junta sees a sermon as against its rule, when articulation is really for the good and for humanity. The reports from the evidence that we were gathering, one of the early reports of this year, we saw there were at least 92 places of worship destroyed, and nearly 25 to 30% of it are Buddhist temples. So everyone's basically being violated by the military junta, and in very, very desperate ways as it tries to cling on to power. Yeah.
Right. I want to bring in the perspective from the genocide framework, because we are, of course, there are people as human individuals, what the torture, arbitrary arrest, being burned alive, executed, summarily. But I think that there's something else that's going on. That is the military junta identifies different populations based on their political values or political identities or religious identities or ethnic identities, right? Say like, Chin Christians, churches destroyed, pastors abused. The same goes in Kachin state in the north as well, right? Then the Karenni people, right? Like, more than half of the Karenni state have been forcibly displaced, and also I think like the IDPs, almost 2 million since the coup 2.5 years ago. They're not collateral; they're targeted, because like collateral simply means that, okay, all right, we did not mean to harm these people, but they got caught in the front, in the crossfire kind of thing. But in the case of Myanmar under military rule or military regime, they're targeting civilians because the resistance getting stronger and better organized, and so they have like a dwindling number of troops. Morale is very, very low, as you mentioned earlier. So they target the soft target, which is the civilian population, women, children, religious communities. And so from a genocide perspective, genocide can take place either in peacetime or in war. And now that we have plunged into civil war effectively since the coup in February 2021, what we are seeing is not just simply the old full cut, the Thompson strategy that was developed in the highlands of Malaya or Malaysia by the British. That was like cut off information, new recruit, the supplies, ammunition, financial support, information, whatnot, right? When a particular regime in power targets populations for destruction. We're talking about wholesale destruction of villages, on the basis of their, say, political opposition. In other words, these are dissident villages. Dissidents have identity as well, not just Buddhists or Muslims or Christians or Chin or other minorities. The political identity is no less an identity than a religious or ethnic identity. So perhaps in your center would look into the targeting of the Democrats as a form of sociological genocide, if not claimed legal, because in the genocide convention, the political identities and populations based on these identities were omitted because the Western and Eastern Bloc could not agree on inclusion of political groups, because politics also an identity. Communists were targeted, right? Capitalists were targeted as reactionaries or enemies of the revolution, and so I think that's one thing that may be worthwhile to look at, political dissidents as a demographic category. And then finally, I want to ask what recommendations you come up with. And I have the serious issue with one particular recommendation that you said, China and India should pressure Myanmar military to stop discrimination, exclusion, and persecution of minorities. And so I think that's quite problematic, because, as you know, China and India themselves, as major powers in the world, are engaged in similarly atrocious religious and minority persecution.
No, certainly. We first of all recognize the problems that, at least in the short term, possibly even medium term, whether we can have a proper, political transition on the side of values, So we didn't want to make any recommendations that would, legitimize the military regime, and also we are not sure where the other political entities outside of Myanmar and how they are, sort of getting themselves ready, if at all. So we felt under these circumstances, the best approach is really to do three things: to monitor, to record, and to denounce all these violations. So this is across the board, and we are calling out, the international community, INGOs, and CSOs. So I think your comment about India and China correctly comes from what we try to articulate, that we want the international community to put pressure, on the junta. I mean, if we can, and to find any forms of leverage. So that's where we were coming from. If some of the international community did have a leverage or were speaking to China or India to lean on Myanmar at that point of contact, but I take your point. But these are, equally problematic, given that these regimes themselves in those countries are not any better. But we came from a point of hope. For INGOs, we tell them to mainstream their contributions to CSO, meaning not just give technical support and raise their voice at UN mechanism, but give them the hard cash they need. Make sure they are properly resourced, because these are the people on the ground. Now, whether you are in country or out country, you need a few dollars to do your work and to survive. And our recommendations to INGO is, don't keep the major pie to yourself when you get large grants and so on. Give out 60%, to the front forces, and make sure they are well resourced. So that's our other caveat in terms of how we approach INGOs. For CSOs, we threw in a caution. We know it's difficult times, but please do your work, safely. This is important for the mid to long term viability of the work they do, monitor, record, and in that sense, if it's not safe to denounce, pass the information out, and those of us out there can do that. And also where they can, there are constraints where they can also quietly, engage in, awareness raising, rights violations. I think it's a continuous journey, and we thought this could be the way to go in terms of recommendation. These we felt were more realistic given the political context of the time, as opposed to raising some highbrow approaches, which may not be feasible. So back to you, Simon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I personally find the report, worthwhile, and it's an important contribution, and I hope you will continue with this type of work. And then one last question: as you may be aware, the Arab journalist who was the head of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. It's a major, the international journalist organization based in Tokyo, and travel on a junket that organized by obviously the Myanmar junta or associates, and he gave an interview in the Myanmar military's propaganda mouthpiece, known as Global New Lights of Myanmar, and he dismissed everything, or he would dismiss everything that you were saying that you found. He was staying in resorts and saying, I'm Muslim, but no one hurts me or attempts to harm me, and the Rohingyas are Bengali illegal migrants. There's no genocides, all exaggerated fake news here. What do you say to these foreign journalists who come on a short a vacation of salt, staying at the fancy resorts and meeting with the Myanmar military junta officials, and then dismissing everything that United Nations or the human rights NGOs or CSOs or all think tanks like yourself have been saying. There are serious the rights abuses that amounting to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And here you have this Arab journalist. He will not be. He was. He's not the first, or no, will he be the last of this kind of like journalists.
Well, it's fake news at the best. So I think one, we have to be cautious that these days journalists are also peddling fake news, especially if you pay them a few dollars and put them in a fancy resort. There are lots of them, around the world, Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. You certainly need to do that. I mean, the days of critical journalism, the way that we would have understood it in the past, is dying or is dead. So we really have to be discerning. But I want to take your point about Japan. I've recently come back from Japan, and I was approached by some of the university professors, Japanese professors, who raised the caution with me. They said they are having some challenges in correctly identifying, because Japan, some universities, they are also responding on how to help people who are leaving the country. So they are giving primarily, postgraduate scholarships. They're opening it up specific for Myanmar nationals, masters and PhD. And they were troubled because they said, look, James, we don't know how to see this, because we are getting a disproportionate number of applications for people who we feel are already well-resourced and very, very entitled and privileged already. And we don't know how to see this. We don't know who is who, right? So certainly there's some anxiety in the Japanese circles, especially in higher education, that are giving out these kind of special scholarships. So what I said to them is perhaps they should have a screening committee beyond varsity. That may include also a couple of informed people from the region as well, or from Myanmar, or people who know Myanmar well, but maybe outside of Myanmar at the moment, in order to properly screen so that the more deserving, people who are underprivileged and would benefit largely from the scholarship. So I just wanted to point out this anomaly of behaviors and situations in Japan, while he may be trying to help, and then you get some of this mismatch taking place. And your example of the journalist to me came out as one clear example. Yeah, back to
Yeah, I
you.
mean, like on the point of like your Japanese colleagues having a difficult time, screening or identifying who is who. I mean, the rule of thumb is the cream of the crop is always climbing, right? And the Democrats or like people with like a very strong commitment to democratization, they have taken up arms and giving up their careers and not seeking scholarships anywhere in the world, And the Democrats are fighting. They have learned to fight. I mean,
Mm.
literally as like revolutionaries, Generation Z and others. And so, it's that's why I'm skeptical of institutions and individuals who say, oh, we need to have a future leaders. We need to give them Western or liberal education. Well, if people are not fighting the regime, not committed to democratization, we won't get to that phase of reconstructing Burma through Western educated people. Most of the Western educated people look for greener pastures and go somewhere else. Look at myself, you know what I mean? And so don't fall for this, the bunch of people who say like, oh yeah, our country is in civil war. I need to leave the country and pursue my PhD somewhere else. The ones who are really committed have to, throw their lot into this revolution, and so salute to them. And so anyway, like we've passed the 1 hour mark, and the my guest today is Dr. James Gomez, the very dynamic regional director of Asia Center, and one of the key investigators of the latest study looking into Myanmar military regimes, the targeting religious and political minorities, well, particularly ethnic and religious minorities. Thank you, James. This has been really educational for me, and I hope it is for others as well.
Thank you, Zani. Always a pleasure to be here with you for the dialogue at FORSEA. I can't wait for our next conversation.
Yeah, yeah. In the meantime, hopefully we'll meet each other in Bangkok next time.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you to